So the Albanese government has seemingly confirmed that its interest in terms of reform broadly in the electoral system for this term of government will be the idea of a potential expansion of the parliament, both the House and the Senate, and also the possibility of constitutional reform to change when elections in this country happen. So last week, the Albanese government announced a parliamentary joint inquiry into the possibility of electoral reform in Australia to address some key issues that are perceived to exist within the Australian political system. So the inquiry's issues that it is going to be looking at and will potentially recommend solutions to at the end of its investigation are, first of all, the idea that Australian electorates on a federal level are far too large in terms of population, and that there is a potential need for an expansion of the House of Representatives and then in turn the Senate, because, well, purely MPs at the moment are representing too many people, with the average constituency at the federal level in Australia having about 120,000 voters in it. And look, this idea of reforming the size of Parliament in line with how the population has grown is something that governments have kind of been kicking down the road since the Howard years. The last time that the Australian Parliament was made any bigger in size was during the Bob Hawke years, back in the 1980s. It's been 40 years since the size of Parliament was meaningfully updated. So we are currently operating under a system when it comes to the number of seats in the country that we were when there were 10 million less people in Australia. I think one of the most concerning consequences of this lack of growth in the House of Representatives is that it's caused some pretty big gaps between the least and most populated seats in the Australian lower house. Because of a provision in the Constitution, every state in Australia gets a minimum of 5 members of Parliament in the lower house. So Tasmania, being the least populated state, even though it probably proportionally does not deserve 5 members of the lower house, it gets 5 members of the lower house. And interestingly, as opposed to the normal 120,000 people per electorate in Australia, in Tasmania, the average is around 70,000. Compare that to the mainland with a seat like Blair on the other end of the spectrum, where they have 140,000 voters. So there are currently electorates in Australia that have double the population of other electorates. Compared to living in Blair, living in Tasmania effectively gives your vote double the say, which I think, at least, look, in my opinion, is a democratic problem. And the solution is very obvious. You add seats in places like Blair that have maybe gotten a little bit bloated in terms of the size of their electorate so that you can bring that number down a little bit. But again, we haven't taken a step like that since the 1980s. Now, the parliamentary inquiry, of course, is just getting together now, and they haven't actually got a number in mind in terms of how much they would want to see Parliament expanded, but I think the number realistically is going to be somewhere in the range of taking the lower house from 150 to 170 to maybe 200 members of the lower house. Realistically, 200 would get you into that range where there would be less than 100,000 voters per electorate, which I think is a little bit arbitrary, but it is a good target to keep in mind in terms of getting more accurate representation across the country. And then the biggest gap wouldn't be 75,000 to 140,000, it would be 75,000 to an extreme of maybe just over 90,000. Not great, but better than what we're currently dealing with. What would the political ramifications of that be? Well, essentially, if current trends continue, political extinction for the Liberal Party. Because if we're adding new seats to the Australian Parliament, we're going to be adding them disproportionately to the most densely populated areas, which are cities and urban areas, which the Liberal Party currently only holds like 10 seats in metropolitan areas. And I was watching a bit from 7 News where they pointed out that 5 of them are in Queensland. So outside of Queensland, in all urban and inner city areas, the Liberal Party has 5 seats, 3 in Sydney, 2 in Melbourne, no more. So if you are adding up to potentially 50 new seats to Parliament, and a decent majority of them are going to be in urban or inner city areas, Well, you've essentially taken the Liberal Party's demographic problem and made it 10 times worse. But beyond the political party ramifications of this, we also need to talk about what this means for the nexus, which is a real thing in the Australian Constitution. If you look it up, nexus meaning connection between two things. The nexus in the Australian Constitution, in Section 24, essentially is a mandate that the number of senators be as accurate as possible to half the number of seats in the House of Representatives. Basically, if the Australian lower house, the House of Representatives, is going to expand to potentially 200 seats, that means that the Senate will have to expand to 100 seats in order to justify that section of the Constitution. Side note, they did try to remove the nexus in a 1967 referendum. It was overwhelmingly rejected by the Australian people in a 60-40 vote. So the nexus isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So anyway, Senate expansion, the most likely way you would be able to pull that off to try and get it to be around 100 would be you take all the Australian states, all 6 of them, and you go from 12 to 16 senators. And then on top of that, something that Albo has talked about before, the idea of expanding senators to the territories, you give both the territories 2 extra senators for a total of 104. First of all, that would be insane. And it's probably going to have... Is it getting dark in here? In an Australian Senate election in any state, suddenly every 3 years we will be electing 8 senators instead of 6. And the quota to get elected would go from just over 14% to around 11%. Which means that we're going to see, if this does happen, we're going to see a lot more minor parties hitting the quota and getting into the Senate. Imagine a Senate election where essentially every single state elects at least 1 member from one nation to the Senate. A crossbench of potentially 12 members of one nation in a 104-member Senate. It's democracy. I can't freak out too much about it. Anyway, that's the expansion of Parliament and what it could look like if it does get proposed by this inquiry when it finalises its investigation sometime in 2026. But there are some other things that's looking at. The next one, which could be legislated, is essentially ending the ability of Australian governments to call elections early. You know, it's a long-standing Westminster tradition that the government of the day can call early elections if it feels like it, if it thinks that it's advantageous enough to do so. And essentially, we could move to a system more like, say, New South Wales at the moment, where terms are essentially fixed and there's no ability for the government of the day to call them early. Anyway, those 2 changes, fixed terms, expansion of Parliament, those can both be done pretty simply through passing legislation. But the third thing that they are investigating would require a constitutional change, and that is potentially the idea of going from 3 to 4-year terms for Parliament. Now, I should state how weird the norm of 3-year terms is for a Parliament. My understanding at the moment is that only 5 countries on Earth do it. It's only us, New Zealand, the Philippines, Mexico, and El Salvador. We are global outliers in terms of our federal 3-year parliamentary terms. I personally, and this is really looking at my personal bias, I don't like the idea of shifting away from these 3-year terms, no matter how unique they are in the world. I think a 3-year term does a couple of things. Beyond my love of frequent elections and following them and just the enjoyment of watching politics in action, I think a 3-year term actually serves a pragmatic purpose in practice. First of all, as you can see in pretty much all of Australian history, we pretty much always give our governments 2 terms. Going all the way back to the 1930s, we have given every government at least 1 try to give it another go. And I feel like that's important because 3 years normally isn't enough for people to really sour on their opinion of a government, and it really gives the government a sort of wake-up call in terms of how they've been doing without getting kicked out of office. I think the best way to explain it is that, yes, we have 3-year terms, but in practice, every party, when they're elected, really gets 6 years in office, almost as a guarantee. And Australian politicians know this. They are very aware of the fact that it is almost guaranteed that when they get into office from opposition, they realistically have 6 years to put their policies in place with a midterm performance review to see how well or how terribly they've been doing. But fortunately for me and my fellow politics lovers, that is probably the least likely thing to actually take place. Because the idea that Albo and his Labor government are going to be brave enough to pursue another referendum after what happened with the voice, incredibly unlikely. So I don't see a massive campaign for a referendum to purely extend parliamentary terms to 4 years. I don't know how likely it is that that will actually come to be. But the other proposals in that, the idea of a parliamentary expansion and fixed terms seems reasonable. It's realistically how we operate anyway. It's not too common nowadays. I don't think anyone's done it since Howard to go for an election early. So yeah, why not formalise the practice anyway? And then in terms of the expansion of Parliament, potentially, at most, 200 MPs and over 100 senators. Despite my concerns, I can't lie, there's a part of me that just in my heart is saying, bring on that chaos and let's see what Australian politics looks like at the next election when we have over 300 members of Parliament to elect. I cannot wait for it.